The entire situation surrounding Catherine receiving exclusive control over the royal treasures basically unfolded at midnight while Charles was practically falling apart, and the two individuals you'd naturally assume would be present, his spouse and his direct successor, were specifically instructed to stay away. That's not a collective family choice. That's someone ensuring nobody interferes with him authorizing something. And truthfully, the reality that he was questioned twice about wanting Camilla or William present and refused, both times reveals more about the internal palace dynamics than any formal declaration ever will. The sequence begins with Charles at a gathering for international representatives in the formal banquet hall at Buckingham Palace, and he simply drops, literally crumbles, before everyone watching. Protection personnel instantly begin confiscating mobile devices from attendees before any single image can emerge, which is understandable considering how controlled they are regarding his appearance currently. But it equally means the sole descriptions of the incident originate from individuals within that space. And the palace has been extraordinarily selective about what they've permitted to spread. Visitors were ushered through alternative exits. Medical professionals were summoned through some passageway nobody even realized existed. And when they departed his quarters, it was approaching midnight. Whatever information they shared with him in that chamber never became public knowledge. And this is where the sequence becomes peculiar. Weeks following that incident, Charles surfaced on screen, stating his medical protocol could be lessened in the upcoming year, which caused everyone to relax, because it seemed like positive developments, like circumstances, were improving. But based on what's currently emerging, that identical week, his physicians had consulted him privately and communicated something entirely opposite. A secondary indicator had become concerning and was advancing quicker than his care providers had anticipated. So you've got two entirely conflicting versions operating simultaneously. The public narrative, deliberately constructed around the term lesson to imply progress, and the confidential one where his professionals are basically instructing him to prepare for circumstances to intensify. And somebody within that residence chose to suppress the secondary assessment and allow everyone to assume the situation was manageable. And that concealed detail is the genuine crisis beneath everything that transpired afterward. Because if you're Charles and you've just received information in a stark private chamber that your remaining period might be significantly briefer than anyone comprehends, you're not considering appointments. You're considering what occurs the instant you're absent. His personal administrator supposedly pleaded with him to delay until daybreak, but Charles declined. Whatever those physicians communicated ignited something within him that wouldn't postpone another moment. The royal attorney got summoned from sleep past midnight and hurried to the residence to observe the authorization of documentation that typically would have required months of legal examination. Instead, everything occurred in a single chamber in the darkness while the remainder of the palace rested. Now, before we continue further, if you're appreciating this analysis, subscribe to Crown Watch so you won't miss what develops next. There's considerably more to this narrative, and it's continuing to develop. The element that genuinely makes this entire situation feel questionable originates from the royal attorney's confidential documentation from that evening. Before authorizing, Charles was questioned twice whether he desired Camilla or William present in that chamber with him. Twice he declined. This wasn't alarm or a hasty choice with insufficient time to consider. He possessed the chance to summon either of them, and he intentionally elected not to. He excluded them both from the chamber where the complete trajectory of his lineage was being reconstructed. And if you're questioning why a deteriorating monarch would exclude the two individuals nearest to him at the most significant moment remaining in his authority, the most probable explanation is simultaneously the most devastating one. Charles didn't desire anyone in that chamber who might remove the instrument from his grasp, delay him, or attempt to inscribe their own identity onto that document before the substance hardened. This wasn't a monarch sharing a choice with his relatives. This was a monarch safeguarding a choice from his relatives. So he authorizes the urgent custodianship directive, transferring exclusive authority of the royal treasures to Catherine. And according to individuals present, he stated precisely 3 phrases when it concluded. It is accomplished. No expression of satisfaction, no comfort, just a monotone, vacant voice of someone who had been bearing this burden for years and ultimately selected this singular dark silent midnight to release it regardless of what it damages the individuals he professed to cherish. And some of you are likely questioning whether a monarch can actually do this independently in the darkness without requesting anyone's authorization. And the response is affirmative. The British Crown operates on something termed the royal authority, which grants a ruling monarch tremendous personal jurisdiction over anything connected immediately to the throne, with no requirement for validation from Parliament or anyone else. And the royal treasures fall directly within that capacity. Lawfully, Charles is permitted to do precisely what he accomplished. No authorization document necessary, no ballot conducted, nothing. But what rendered this so exceptional wasn't whether he possessed the authority. It was the velocity. Choices like this typically extend across years, addressed quietly behind sealed chambers, negotiated and tempered, so nobody is abandoned unprepared. Charles discarded all of that completely. He compressed years of cautious preparation into one midnight authorization. And that alone communicated to everyone precisely how much duration he assumed he still possessed remaining. When you genuinely examine what these treasures have previously endured, it positions the entire situation in clarity. They were eliminated once previously centuries earlier, liquefied entirely in a calculated effort to erase the crown from existence. And still, the custom recovered from absolute nothing. They endured being taken from the core of the Tower of London by someone shrewd enough to obtain the Guardian's confidence before betraying him. They endured two global conflicts, rebellions, the gradual dissolution of dominions, and now following all of that, their destiny for the subsequent phase was determined by one terrified, depleted individual at a moment when the remainder of the palace was completely unaware, with no comprehension their complete trajectory was being reconstructed without them. But while Charles remained isolated with what he'd just accomplished, Camilla was moments from discovering that she had never genuinely belonged to this lineage. And when she discovered, she wasn't surrendering peacefully. Camilla didn't learn about the directive from her spouse. She learned it from a personnel member hours, following the authorization, communicated in that measured, distant manner individuals employ when they recognize their statements are about to explode. And the instant she learned it, she was immediately advancing toward Charles's chamber. Here's where it becomes even more complicated. In her rage, Camilla neglected to completely seal the chamber entrance behind her. So, a personnel member positioned nearby captured every individual phrase. She directly informed Charles that he had rendered her insignificant while she was still existing alongside him as his spouse. And Charles's response wasn't an expression of regret. It was something harsher. He simply informed her the throne was never something a spouse retains. It was exclusively something she was permitted to utilize. That individual statement eliminated everything courteous this lineage had ever claimed to represent. He wasn't characterizing Camilla a companion. He was characterizing her a visitor, someone who had been allowed to possess a few attractive items temporarily, constantly on the comprehension that none of it was ever genuinely hers. To comprehend why that wounds so profoundly, you must comprehend what being a partner in the House of Windsor genuinely signifies. A partner doesn't acquire the throne. A partner doesn't acquire the royal treasures. A partner exclusively utilizes admission to certain adornments for certain functions, constantly at the satisfaction of the ruling monarch, and constantly with the quiet comprehension that when he expires, most of that admission automatically vanishes with him. Camilla had constantly recognized this in a remote theoretical manner, the manner someone recognizes an uncomfortable reality they'd prefer not examine immediately. But hearing it communicated to her directly in the identical moment as the declaration that another individual had just been granted permanent, legal, complete authority over those identical treasures transformed an old theoretical reality into a recent personal injury. And this eruption didn't originate from nowhere. It had been accumulating for years. Long before this evening, Camilla had individually requested the palace adornment department to permit her to display a particular historical gemstone accessory for an official journey that signified profoundly to her. She was informed it required additional examination. That examination never arrived and no clarification followed. It just disappeared into the identical distant silence this residence has mastered for generations. Then 2 years subsequently, that precise identical accessory surfaced around Catherine's throat at an official reception with zero notification provided to Camilla beforehand. She discovered the identical manner millions of observers did, observing it transpire broadcast on her viewing device. And Camilla never once protested publicly regarding that accessory. She maintained composure through every image, participated in the identical occasions, remained alongside Catherine at formal gatherings as though nothing had ever transpired. But according to individuals who have collaborated intimately with her across the years, she maintained a confidential, meticulous documentation of every individual function where something she had once quietly requested for resurfaced subsequently on someone else. The documentation isn't sensational independently, but accumulated together, they illustrate the representation of an individual who invested years silently calculating every offense while displaying the public a composed, controlled appearance. That variety of patient concealed fury tends to be considerably more threatening than anything vocal because it never diminishes. It exclusively accumulates. As if that wasn't sufficient, a personnel member near the chamber that evening captured something even darker. Camilla supposedly stated, she declined to be the secondary spouse eliminated from two narratives simultaneously. For years, residence insiders have quietly compared her against Princess Diana, the cherished initial spouse whose remembrance she has invested decades attempting to escape. And now here she remained, displaced for a secondary occasion in her own existence. This occasion by an individual young enough to be her descendant. An individual who wasn't even within the structure when this choice regarding her own lineage's inheritance got completed behind her awareness. Twice dismissed, decades separated, and constantly for the identical devastating justification. Camilla would constantly be the individual who arrived secondary, regardless of how intensely she struggled to be perceived as anything else. Charles didn't summon after her when she rotated and departed forcefully. He remained positioned precisely where he was, observing downward at the documentation that had just created a separation through his union. Nobody in that residence recognized yet what Camilla intended to do with the rage she was currently bearing, and that uncertainty alone should alarm anyone observing this lineage closely, because an individual who has absorbed one offense after another for years doesn't simply disregard the evening her own spouse characterized her a temporary user within her own residence. What transpires now is genuinely anyone's speculation. Will Camilla quietly absorb this, the manner she has absorbed every other offense before it, documenting it away in that identical confidential record and continuing to maintain composure for the observers? Or has something within her ultimately fractured past the threshold of quiet tolerance? Individuals close to the household characterized her in the days that transpired as unusually detached. She bypassed several minor obligations she would typically never miss, and even declined to respond when journalists immediately questioned her regarding Catherine's recent position. And silence within a lineage constructed completely on deliberately managed public presentations is rarely ever just silence. It's almost constantly a choice being completed behind sealed chambers. And while Camilla remained with the injury of being eliminated, the individual who had just assumed her position without ever requesting the conflict that arrived attached with it was already deteriorating under a burden nobody had troubled to clarify to her. Before any of this became formal, Catherine had observed Charles directly in the vision and pleaded with him to delay. Not indefinitely, she informed him, just until circumstances were less agonizing for everyone in this lineage. But Charles stated negative. There would be no delaying, regardless of how much agony it deposited on the individuals remaining nearest to him. That response alone communicated to everyone precisely how frantic he had become. To comprehend why Catherine even attempted to request, you must comprehend what she had previously endured to arrive here. She constructed her own trajectory with her own capabilities, in functioning within her lineage's modest enterprise and acquiring knowledge through years of typical grinding effort instead of being granted anything. Then illness approached her too and compelled her from public existence for months, while the complete public speculated behind her awareness. Catherine struggled her manner back from that quietly, without objection, and reconstructed her position fragment by fragment until she was remaining alongside a visibly deteriorating monarch before the complete public, with everyone in that chamber completely comprehending what her attendance there was intended to communicate. She had previously conquered one struggle. Nobody anticipated her to endure. Now she had been granted another one, and this occasion there was no completion boundary visible. On top of all that, Catherine had accomplished something almost nobody else in this lineage managed to execute. She rendered ancient neglected fragments of royal narrative feel active again to a generation that had matured bypassing everything else. Old adornments that once remained neglected in containment suddenly surfaced on her at precisely the correct instant, and the public couldn't cease discussing them. Royal observers had invested years noting this configuration, characterizing it something close to a talent, an uncommon perception for reviving forgotten treasures that history had nearly concealed. That perception was precisely why Charles trusted Catherine with all of it. Now, even as it separated his own union separately in the procedure, he wasn't simply safeguarding the adornments physically. Charles was gambling the trajectory of the complete establishment on the single individual he assumed could transport it forward without permitting it to diminish into irrelevance. So, what precisely is Catherine now possessing? This isn't just an attractive designation or an image chance. The complete crown's royal treasures are under her identity alone. The imperial state crown remains at the foundation, covered with gemstones valued more than most nations possess in their reserves. The St. Edward's crown is even more consecrated, and so valuable it exclusively emerges once in a complete generation at the precise instant a recent monarch is crowned before the public. Then there's the Cullinan gemstone extracted from the surface under devastating colonial extraction circumstances that consumed the existences of laborers whose identities were never even documented. And then there's the Koh-i-Noor gemstone, and this is where the narrative becomes genuinely savage. The Koh-i-Noor's history doesn't present like the narrative of an attractive adornment transferred gently from possession to possession. It presents like a casualty calculation. Possessors who once possessed it were disabled. Some were mistreated until they surrendered it. Others were terminated by competitors desperate enough to eliminate for it. Even currently, more than one territory still openly maintains it was taken, not presented, but extracted away during a duration the throne would prefer the public disregard completely. Catherine hasn't acquired an attractive fragment of adornment to appreciate behind protection. She has acquired a gemstone that multiple authorities still characterize taken possession. And now she's the one lawfully accountable for maintaining it, secured away, whether she completely comprehends what she was accepting or not. Representatives from those territories have presented the matter quietly at formal gatherings for years, constantly dismissed or deflected with courteous silence. And now that silence remains directly on Catherine's capabilities instead of Charles's, whether she requested that acquisition or not. To render circumstances even more disturbing, these treasures have previously been eliminated once before, and they recovered from nothing. In 1649, the complete original assembly got liquefied completely. The precious metal extracted and the gemstones distributed in a calculated effort to erase the crown from existence permanently. But it recovered in 1661, reconstructed from destruction by individuals who declined to permit it expire. It's also been taken precisely once in 1671 by an individual named Thomas Blood. And the manner he executed it should transmit a sensation down your awareness. Thomas didn't penetrate through a secured entrance like a typical violator. He invested months deliberately obtaining the confidence of the containment's own guardian, participating meals at his surface, becoming an associate the individual would never distrust, before he ultimately attempted to depart directly from the Tower of London with the imperial state crown concealed under his garment. He got apprehended, and in a development almost nobody recalls. Currently, the monarch of the period was so affected by his absolute audacity that he excused him entirely instead of transmitting him to his termination. Researchers have debated for centuries about why that excuse was ever provided. Some maintain the monarch simply respected boldness. Others suggest that Thomas recognized information regarding the throne threatening enough to acquire his own liberation. Either manner, the treasure has exclusively ever been taken once, and it was taken by the single individual the guardian trusted most in the complete public. Now, request yourself something uncomfortable. Catherine is currently the individual remaining nearest to these treasures of anyone existing. What transpires when the individual trusted the most also occurs to be the individual with the most to obtain from everything secured within that containment. Catherine is possessing history absorbed in terminations, rebellions, and disloyalty. And she's possessing it without a single assurance, communicated or documented, that any of it will endure her parent-in-law's expiration. Because behind sealed chambers, the throne's own attorneys were previously suggesting to each other the single question absolutely nobody desired, communicated it audibly. When William and Catherine initially obtained the capacity to provide royal authorizations, the residents organized a complete commemoration around it. Declarations, statements, information distributions granted to render it feel like victorious positive developments. But this occasion, there was nothing. No information gathering, no clarification connecting any of it to Charles's deteriorating condition. Just a quiet legal documentation concealed where nobody would consider to examine. And that silence communicates louder than any information distribution ever could. Every individual element of this narrative collides together right here. Charles's condition has been characterized uncertain by individuals close to him. And that's a phrase that should alarm anyone who comprehends what it genuinely signifies originating from within a residence. The public was informed his protocol was being lessened, never that it was terminating. And now we ultimately comprehend precisely why that phrase was selected with so much attention. The authorization capacities alone are previously historical. So historical that even Diana, the most cherished royal spouse this lineage has ever possessed, was never provided that identical jurisdiction while she was existing. The Indian circlet extracted from a containment, after 20 untouched years, just so Catherine could display it, publicly transmitted a communication that the crown desired the public to assume it was powerful and stable, regardless of what was deteriorating behind sealed chambers. And there's the statement that has pursued this lineage for months. The composed, unsettling admission from individuals close to the residence that William and Catherine have been prepared for whatever was demanded of them. Just examine closely at the configuration, constructing underneath every individual one of these actions. And a representation begins to develop that's impossible to once perceive. Each declaration arrived quietly, presented as typical, never once structured publicly as immediate. Each one independently could be clarified away as typical succession preparation that any extended ruling monarch might organize years beforehand. But accumulated together in this sequence, at this velocity, they cease appearing like cautious preparation and begin appearing like an individual competing against the timepiece. Only he can observe progressing. Royal researchers who have examined past authorities state they cannot locate another illustration of this many substantial capacities transferring this rapidly without a formal declaration ever validating why. There's something else here too, and something harsher than lineage dynamics. Everywhere Catherine proceeds, whatever she displays distributes nearly instantly. The configuration is so powerful, it's become its own quiet financial mechanism, propelling this complete crown forward. Assemblies behave differently around her. Recording devices pursue her extended. So Charles comprehended precisely what he was accomplishing by positioning these treasures in her capabilities specifically. He wasn't just safeguarding adornments. He was ensuring the single individual capable of maintaining this complete establishment existing for a recent generation was also the single individual now lawfully connected to its most consecrated representations. But here's what has never been stated publicly until now. According to individuals familiar with confidential deliberations transpiring within the residence, at minimum one senior legal consultant presented a possibility dark enough to disturb anyone who assumes the narrative is concluded. That consultant supposedly suggested that Camilla, as Charles's enduring spouse, could one day employ her legal position as his bereaved to transport this precise directive into a tribunal following Charles is absent. Nothing. This inflexible, obligatory, complete custodianship of the throne's most consecrated and challenged treasures to someone who isn't even the monarch yet has ever been attempted this distant ahead of a genuine coronation in this lineage's complete history, which signifies everything Catherine has just endured, the confrontation, the devastating pressure, the burden of safeguarding treasures with casualty previously absorbed into their history, might not be the termination of this conflict at all. It might exclusively be the commencing action. Legal researchers who examine the royal authority have quietly indicated that a challenge like this would transport British tribunals into domain nobody has ever evaluated, compelling administrators to determine whether even a monarch's authorized phrase can endure a furious bereaved determined to struggle for what she assumes was extracted from her. And then there's trooping the color. According to individuals close to the preparation of that occasion, residence personnel have quietly commenced employing terminology typically reserved for functions of historical conclusion, the precise variety of terminology individuals employ when they privately assume they're observing something for the absolute final occasion. Additional medical personnel have been incorporated to the typical coverage, an element nobody within the residence has clarified and nobody has troubled to dismiss either. Why would anyone require additional physicians remaining by for a ceremony that has operated every individual year for generations without an individual incident? Request yourself that, and you previously recognize why so many individuals close to this lineage assume they recognize precisely what's approaching. Some insiders have even proceeded further, suggesting that preparations are previously quietly being constructed for what arrives immediately following. Emergency arrangements nobody desires identified immediately, but everybody in that structure previously comprehends. Nothing this immediate has separated through this lineage since one previous monarch departed from the throne completely for the individual he cherished. A choice that disturbed this establishment to its foundations and transformed its trajectory permanently. What's transpiring now feels just as seismic, and the foundation underneath this lineage is transferring quicker than the public has ever been permitted to perceive. History doesn't typically declare itself with an information distribution. It transpires in authorized documentation in midnight chambers and in ancient adornments, positioned on a capability that was never supposed to transport them yet until suddenly, without notification, without ceremony, it does. The genuine question was never simply whether Catherine becomes monarch one day. It was constantly how soon that day ultimately arrives, and whether the throne she's safeguarding right now will even still belong to her when it does.